Welcome to Church and State with Dave Pellowe. This morning I'm talking with Eleni Arapoglu, who comes from a long line of Greek peasants. That's on you, Eleni. That's your words, not mine. You also have a degree, Bachelor in Business from Swinburne University and a graduate certificate in journalism from the epicenter of Marxism in Australia, La Trobe University. So something that's a little bit more credible for our purposes today is the conservative credential of having been the policy researcher for the Australian Christian Party for several years until recently in Victoria. Now, you've written an article called From Russia with Love, an essay on one nation's experiment with marriage that demonstrates why voting yes is a choice to deconstruct family, marriage, and the road to statism again. And just to clarify, you mean Russia, not Pauline Hanson's One Nation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So tell me, what made you start investigating what Russia under communism and Stalin and Lenin was doing with marriage 100 years ago? Now, the saying goes, those that ignore or forget history are doomed to repeat it. What did you find out, and what are you trying to achieve with this article?
Well, for me, it was an inquiry. It wasn't meant to be just simply vote no or vote yes, because we know that all ideas you can track them back. They don't come in a vacuum. There's usually significant historical ideas that have helped shaped culture, and then you get to a situation where we are today in the Western, particularly in the Western nations, where it's almost by osmosis. We pick up generational ideas and they are transferred to us generationally, but we don't understand quite why we feel that way. Given things like statements like, I believe education should be free, or I believe everyone has a right to this, or free health, or whatever. And so we inherit.
Did you actually quote it? But I think I heard somebody recently quote Nietzsche, I think, saying that everybody is inadvertently an exponent of dead philosophers.
I've never heard that, no, but I do quote him in the essay, just to give and the essay is very deliberately looking at the ideas first before the action came. So there's always, I suppose, everyone who thinks that you're free to think whatever you like, and that of course is true. But when we start actually putting them out there, and these ideas take some kind of root, they have real world consequences, and I wanted to emphasize that. So I had begun exploring Marxism and marriage a little bit a couple of years ago when I was writing on family-centered economics. And so I knew a little bit about the fact that they were antagonistic towards monogamous marriage. And most people sort of get that. But I wanted to dig deeper as to why they felt that way, and why it exploded the way it did. Because it had massive ramifications for Russia. And of course, Russia today has gone back to sort of really pushing the monogamous relationship, but that's a huge cultural shift. And so it was educational. It's also the fact that I have a daughter doing year 12 in English literature. They always interpret through a post-Marxist, post-feminist prism. And it's part of the national curriculum. So these ideas, when I started listening to her and seeing how militant the Yes campaign was, and overseas with Antifa and whatever else, and they're not getting much coverage, the neo-Marxists are, but not Antifa, which has communist, hard communist leanings.
That's right.
I really thought, well, this has to have something deeper. It needed to start off from some place, and I wanted to identify what that place was. So the essay is really trying to piece these things together, and a plea to people to sort of see that, look, what we decide today, while you may be compassionate and really feel, empathetic towards, because everyone knows someone who's gay.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Is there something else that we're not seeing and will come upon us because we've been blinded, I think, through the lack of history?
Look, that's a really good point, because what the Yes campaign seems to be very desperate for us to avoid is any kind of close scrutiny of their agenda, their motives, or the flow-on consequences. In fact, methinks thou doth protesteth too much.
Absolutely.
But what are they so afraid of us finding when we look at what's happened in history, both 100 years ago and 1 year ago?
Absolutely.
And it's
absolutely.
a really good question. I don't know when the last time was we decided a piece of legislation without considering the consequences, but it seems like a really poor way to make important decisions.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I do believe a lot of people that are rallying behind and have picked up this spirit of aggression and we're on the right side and we've got to push now and whatever else, I think they're suffering from the same problems that a lot of the population is suffering from, which is a lack of information, a lack of historical information to piece it together. And so when they're angry, they're picking that up from something and they're not quite sure why. But usually if you start to sort of piece it together and stop and pause, people will generally say, yeah, that's valid. What's happening though, it's running so fast, it's come now to a point where of desperation almost, that we have to have it now, and it can't be any other time. We can't wait 1 year until we have an election and we all just, along with our vote, we put in a yes or no. They don't want the discussion. So, usually when something is done with that much angst and that much haste, it's going to be a disaster. Yeah. And so all I wanted to do was say, hang on, there is a historical precedent and it looks almost identical, the reverse pattern. So the revolution came first and then they started taking apart everything.
Okay.
And this is the reverse because they've learnt over time. To start pulling everything down gradually, wearing Western civilization down to the point when then there's no more opposition and they can mount that last coup d'etat, just take it all over.
So 100 years later, the revolution is not a militant, as in the literal sense of the word, rifles and blood revolution.
It's a cultural one.
A cultural revolution from within the institutions itself.
Absolutely. So that was Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian communist, and he saw the wreckage of the 1917, I'll broadly say Lenin's revolution. But of course there were many people involved. And he realised that, and especially when you take it back, and I couldn't put it all in, if you look and study the Balkans and what was happening there, it was ripe for, all that area was ripe for resolution because there had been, centuries old.
You mean revolution, or you said resolution?
Revolutions.
Revolution.
With a V, yeah. Yep. So all of that area had been stained with continual warfare, blood feuding over culture, over, this is the seat of the Roman Empire had moved into these areas. It was just, you could see how communism could very easily take over the minds of the people who had, it's always the peasants that suffer. So they could take them over with these ideas, and you see that communism was experimented on very heavily. Hungary, Bulgaria, Greece has a very deep communist roots. Italy, you just go on and on and on and on. And it was devastating. The human loss for me was quite sickening. And of course that links into, that's why I try to emphasize the philosophical foundations, that man is a mere animal. Which is quite
so
funny.
Many people today subscribe to that. I can't believe how many people insist that they are nothing more than an animal, to me.
Absolutely. But the contrary part, when you look at Marx, so they have these master and slave and whatever else, is that they go about telling you that there is nothing from nothing. But then, of course, they're constantly in this process of creating an order. So that they're using, their argument is contradictory in a lot of ways, where they're always setting about tearing down and reordering, and yet they tell you there's no master architect. So, they're following that same pattern, but of course there's no grounding. And so this is where the whole idea of taking and sorry, just to backtrack a little bit, it's not that Marx did not have any validity to what he was saying. So I have to be fair when I bring that across. Industrialization, and because it was sort of the beginnings of all that, well, they were really harsh environments, especially towards children. The problem is, of course, is that Marx starts with these loose foundations of an amoral world, and we make this world what we want. He sees the injustices, which is again a contradiction, because what is evil? How do you define it?
Yep.
And then he jumps from there and takes down everything in this fury of, we're going to take down the old order. He just simply wants to dismantle everything. So where we get from the injustice to building the new order is the problem. And his is one of anything that stands, and certainly Lenin advocated that, anything that stands in the way of the revolution has to be gone. The other irony about Lenin, and I'm reading a book at the moment on the Russian Revolution, is that he pretty much predominantly spent all his time with academics and intellectuals. So for all the rhetoric that this is a peasants' movement and today this is a mass revolution for the people, it's coming from academics and intellectuals again. So they're the ones that are thinking, you know what, I'm sorry, you're all sheep, and we're going to lead you to this genderless, classless. We actually don't know what it is, but we think it'll look like this. So that's
what they're saying. So tell me what part marriage had to play in the Marxist agenda that Lenin's revolution implemented.
Well, all of that was, just to backtrack a little bit, so the main people in there was Freud. It was a mixture of him, Marx, Engels, and so forth. They all felt that the bourgeoisie family, as they named it, so the nuclear family of a father, mother, and children, was incredibly restrictive, and it was allowing this capitalist system to exist, and keeping them beholden to it. The issue there, of course, is mother-father, because it's biologically possible for only them two to have a child. It is the smallest self-governing unit that you can develop naturally. Once you dismantle that, and they understood that, once you rip that little unit apart, of course the roles there of protector, provider, nurturer have to be taken over by someone else or something else. And they understood that this state of communal happiness, enforced communal happiness, could only happen if those tight bonds that occurred naturally were torn apart. So they've subscribed to this kind of village mentality that we all look after one another, and no one, and it actually dates back to Plato in his writings on the Republic, and this whole idea of who owns the child. And of course Plato advocated, I think from the age of 2, that after that the parents should let go of the child and should become educated and pretty much government property.
Wow.
So it dates back to that roughly, and they understood the mechanics of that. You cannot control a society unless you start to be able to take apart those very natural relationships of father, mother, and child. And of course they then become, especially children in the Russian Revolution, because the government became their pseudo father, mother, and nurturer, because they also had the welfare state. There was a famous case, and I've got it in the essay, where the child betrayed the parents. And later on, when he was killed during the revolution, there were statues that went up in honour of him as a martyr for the revolution. And that's a very natural progression. You would expect that. You don't bite the hand that feeds you. So this is where the understanding happened, and the other thing that I point out in the essay, of course...
That harkens remarkably similar to what's going on with safe schools at the moment, where the government is usurping the parental authority to instill their values in their children.
Yeah.
And the government says, no, whatever you say, it must agree with us. That we, Absolutely. The government, we have the only moral authority to teach and approve what values the next generation is instilled with. Parental authority is irrelevant. Unless you agree with us, you're wrong. And we will teach your children what we want, and we won't require your permission, and we won't even require your knowledge that it's happening. We will just do it. You see in Victoria that Comrade Andrews has just decided that the children can be given contraceptives from the age of 12. Like, that's just ridiculous, without the parents' knowledge or agreement.
So whether he's actively taking on those principles, or like I said, it's just what it's become. You just sort of know that that's the trajectory that it all goes. He's taking it one step further. So if he gets into government again in Victoria, I think we're going to have an election late next year. He wants mandatory now in every school to have a doctor and a lawyer to protect the children's rights, and this has got to do with
from oppressive parents, of course.
Oppressive parents. So again, the narrative has been set up that the whole mother, father, children is oppressive. It is, of course, the way that traditionally values are filtered through, and they understand that you can't have both. And this is why historically too, you see, especially in America, with limited government, constitutionally protected rights, they enforced the family and all its values because it's suited to limited government and less government interference. And that's why I specifically put statism in there, because deconstructing the family and this top-down, the bureaucrats and academia and the intellectuals and the technocrats will tell us what's right for us, of course, is suited to the big government, socialist, communist ideal. So that's why they're so polar. One absolutely says that these values are suited to a freedom narrative, and the other one says it's suited to a serfdom narrative. And so it's critical. Once we decide on that, we are going to go one way or the other, and that's I don't think you can stop that. And everything they say, they did do that in Russia, of course. After the revolution, they had the 1918 code, and it was debated a little bit. But the voices of the peasants that were saying, hey, what's this going to do with, the logical reasoning if you tell me that there is no exclusivity in marriage, wouldn't that open the doors to polygamy and polyamory? And no, it'll be two people. But of course the logic breaks down, because if you haven't got two people that are coming together to produce something new, and you're attaching children to a relationship of anyone who says I'm a parent, there is no logical reason why you'd keep it to two of anything, because two is just a pair, it's not a couple. It can't create anything new. So that their logic breaks down. And of course Russia, that happened often, and it was chaos. And of course the children paid for it twice, because when Stalin came in, I do believe from reading it was a practical measure, because the guy was absolutely without any empathy. He was ruthless. So there was that social chaos that he wanted to again bring under control. But when he sent the hundreds of thousands of people into gulags, again you had another wave of homelessness. And so the children paid for it enormously twice. Generationally, it's probably still filtering through. So, it's heartbreaking stuff. And I just think it's a story that needs to be retold. Yeah.
So Lenin, the mess that Lenin created, which Stalin tried to fix, and the success of which is further commentary, but notably, Stalin observed that Lenin's plans for marriage had failed even the Marxist goals. They'd become totally anarchy. They'd become unworkable.
Absolutely.
So what exactly did Lenin do? He introduced polygamy, or he made marriage irrelevant?
So they just basically made what they called, I think the term was erotic
friendships,
or it was based on the party principle of comrades should be able to sort of have this free love amongst themselves. And
but that wasn't monogamous. The erotic friendships could have been anybody.
I think their party policy at some stage actually saw monogamous relationships as a first-class antagonism against the state. So, you might want that. They're saying you can have any relationship where you want, but really what they were saying, that if you have this monogamous relationship, you're really not part of the revolution.
Wow.
And so, that will happen again. Obviously, we're all going to say we'll have same-sex marriage and we'll have all this other stuff, but you'd be sneered at.
Yeah.
So, because you're not progressive enough. So
that was the first free love sexual revolution of the last century. It wasn't in the 60s. It was in the teens.
No. Yeah, absolutely. And, there was this generational sort of confusion as well. I have to be fair. The older sort of, the older generation was struggling, even though they were for the revolution, they were struggling with what was happening to their youth. That was seeing that really sort of explosion of sexual anarchy. And I have to say, from what I've read, the uptake of divorce was higher amongst the men than the women. So, you sort of...
How does that work?
I don't know.
Both divorced evenly?
Yeah, I don't. So this whole idea that the feminists and Colin Ty Alexandra, and I talk about her.
Was it because of polygamy that a man could marry 20 wives? That
I just
he could divorce one of them, and so divorce was easier.
Yeah, look, it just became anything you make it, really.
Interesting.
The other thing that happened was that some of the younger girls, probably maybe was across the board, I don't know, but would then target a rich peasant's son and be impregnated and then ask for, alimony or whatever it is,
maintenance.
Maintenance. So it just fell apart because the assumption that I think when Marxism really falls apart, the assumption has to do with human nature.
Yeah.
So where you see the Christian, Judeo...
And that's because they presume that Marxism, socialism presumes everybody's generous and entirely motivated to look after everybody else and work really hard without incentives.
Yeah, and they don't.
It's not reality.
As the welfare system becomes unmanageable, it's sending a message that... we'll look after you. You don't have to do very much. But the idea...
It's a well-known statistic that prior to the welfare system in America, African Americans had a roughly 1 in 4, 25% single mother rate of family makeups. And over the next 20 years, as they started door knocking and telling people that they could get government money if there was no man in the house, but not if there was, then where they're at today is 75% of African American families are fatherless. And because the state is taking over the responsibility of the individuals.
Yeah, so instead of being a safety net, because we know everyone goes through hard times.
It becomes a reward for irresponsibility.
This whole system... And this is where, the genderless theory and all of that, it becomes the dominant worldview. And that's the problem we're facing. So if it's one view competing in the marketplace of ideas and we can all debate it freely, and it's sort of like on the periphery, it probably wouldn't be a problem. But this is now, you see that sort of, that aggressive takeover where we're not just interested in being in a liberal, secular, Western democratic nation. We need it to be dominant. We need it to be absolutely on every level. And this is another sort of, I suppose, criticism of the socialist, communist sort of mindset that a lot of people pick up. On every level, it ends up as a movement of greed. What you have, whether I'm entitled to it or not, whether I have a right to it or not, if you've got it, I want it.
Yep.
So this redistribution on all levels, societal and economic.
What's yours is ours, what's mine is mine.
Something like that, yeah. So this is the problem, and it's come from this, we'll make everything fairer. Of course, that's never quite defined what they mean by that. And it gets to the point now where it's worn away, any defences. So you're trying to speak into multiple generations now that have grown up with a sense of not natural rights, but a sense of entitlement, and they're not sure why. They just feel, if I feel this way, then I should be entitled to something. I'm not sure quite what.
Similarities are remarkable, aren't they?
Yeah, so then you have academics coming on that, playing on that level, that are telling them what they need to do. So I'm very sympathetic and empathetic towards, at a lot of these rallies that I've seen, there's a lot of young kids, impressionable kids, that I don't think they're all conspiring and sort of saying, I really hate you because you're white and you're Christian and whatever else. I think they're in that sort of, that flux of everything and that sort of movement that's pushing so aggressively forward. And they're told this is the right way, that we're on the right side. And they're caught up in that, as it would be of any and Russia would have been, of course, like that as well.
Yeah. It's remarkable that in 1917 Russia and in 2017 Australia, that you can see the similarities between, if you don't agree with this new redefinition of morality, which is actually immorality, then you are a bad citizen. You actually hate the progress that we're trying to achieve as a society. Absolutely. And you are an insurgent, a traitor, and you are an evil person if you don't agree with our redefinition of what's right and wrong. It's
absolutely
remarkable similarities.
It is remarkable because the ideas don't allow for any competition. And they obviously take that on, that spirit of the revolution, without really understanding why. It's like groupthink.
It very much is, yeah.
Take it all on, but you're not quite sure why you're feeling or saying these things. But you're sort of being propelled forward. Like I said, and I wanted to emphasize it, that it has historical, philosophical roots, and they have far-reaching consequences. And within the West, we've seen, because they've eradicated so much of that history, or they've sort of glossed it over. So a lot of these revolutionaries are seen as, poster boys for the progressive movement. And it's filtered through to everyone that's graduating, so I don't, indoctrinating the masses.
Talk to me about the role cultural Marxism, neo-Marxism, or in fact classical Marxism in 1917 as per your research. Tell me the role education has to play in that, from primary school through to tertiary.
Well, it's pivotal. Marx understood that. Certainly Gramsci advocated that quite powerfully, that was the foolproof way of getting this on a mass level. And so a lot, as I talk about in the essay, a lot of those ideas began in Germany, in the Leipzig school, and a lot of those, I think, I can't remember his name, but a lot of them came over to the West in high levels of learning. It was a fusion of educational psychology and whatever else, and they sort of started moving away from the traditional educational model, but really started critical theory, especially, is embedded in cultural Marxism.
Quickly define critical theory for viewers that don't know what that is.
I can't remember. I'm sorry. I've got it written somewhere. But
let me have a crack. Informally, critical theory is part of the revolution. It's basically the destruction of everything. So anything that's orthodox, traditional, conventional, institutional is wrong. Absolutely everything must be criticised and demolished.
A little bit back from that, critical theory is, and I suppose it has some validity. You can see that it has some something that you can hold on to, which is to critique. But of course, we're not talking about the classic critiquing.
But it's a critique with a foregone conclusion.
It's poking holes.
It's not a critique to find truth.
No, it's not.
It's a critique with the prejudice that everything is wrong.
That's right. And it starts from the premise that
we're all, and like you said, it sounds right. You can sort of we're meant to think critically, but that doesn't mean think cynically. Yeah.
Well, that's right. But it actually means philosophical basis is based on all that. You can't know any truth. You can't sort of like any time really arrive. Then you're basically what they do is that they poke holes at all the major ideological positions that have made the West what it is today. Christianity, of course, is right in its crosshairs because of the fact that it advocates one truth. It talks about a lot of truth, but that one truth of there being a God. So there's something external to us, order, purpose, meaning,
accountability.
And laws that constrain us.
Natural law, yeah.
Natural law, and that's something that they understood that needed to be completely eradicated. And this is the evolution, I suppose, in some ways, of going from natural rights, observable rights, which the classic civil rights movements were able to sort of understand, especially Martin Luther King, the idea of imago Dei, that God in me, his image in me, made me, whether I'm black, white, male or female, gave me the right to exist, to work and to enjoy all the privileges of being human, not the fact that I could look at something and envy it and want it. So it was based on something grounded, and that had to be eradicated for cultural Marxism to replace it with situational ethics, with the sense of, and I do write about it in the essay, and a lot of people have observed that. They were able to pick up the nuances of the classical civil rights movements, the language, especially the language, because once you give the language new overtones, again, people just assume that that's what it's all about. So gay rights, for example, 50 years ago, gay did not even mean homosexual. Yeah. So again, you're taking these meanings and reconstructing them. The rainbow, taking something that no one has rights over. It's a natural phenomenon. But of course, in biblical language, we know Noah's flood. Yep. And so they take that over, something very innocent, and overlay it with a new meaning. And it's extraordinarily well done, I have to say.
No, they're past masters, probably for 100 years now at propaganda.
Well. Yeah, absolutely. So this is how it's done, and there are there's heaps of literature about the infiltration of Marxist ideology into the West. Interestingly, there was also a famous interview by a KGB defector that talked about how they actively, I think in the 70s, brought about liberal theology in the West. So, they might have lost the Cold War, but they certainly weren't down and out. And they've been very successful in bringing the sort of the pillars of the socialist come communist ideal and making them sound very ordinary, very much what democratic nations need. And now they're at that sort of that last, I suppose, step of deconstructing society through marriage. Marriage is really the one. And like I say in the essay, once you sort of take away that last significant piece of legislation defining man and woman in their relationship, why do we have marriage? That's my question a lot of the time. Why not just have civil unions? Yep. It's there for a reason, because it's observed in biology, in nature. People have been doing that since time immemorial. It's just what happens. Yep.
Government didn't invent it. Government observed it.
Observed it and saw it was a natural good and wanted to protect it.
And promote it.
And promote it, absolutely. And that's consistent with a Western democratic view.
There is no social benefit to any other type of relationship.
That's right.
Everybody, imago Dei. Every individual bears the image of God. You have equal value, equal dignity. Government can't take that from you. Government can't give that to you. Yeah. No, you aren't a second-class citizen, because there is no such thing. Imago Dei, that's the nature of our society. Absolutely. Based on Judeo-Christian values, there are no second-class citizens, but there are different types of relationships, and marriage is unique. Absolutely. And only marriage has that unique benefit for society of progeny, of the future, Absolutely. Of procreation, of productivity. Yeah. No other relationship is as productive or as healthy or as beneficial. And you can scream and rage against reality, but you're shouting in the wind. It actually doesn't change anything. And redefining reality is a futile exercise.
Well, it is. And you know, the natural consequences from that is if that you don't have people naturally in a relationship to produce children. And I think it was Justice Scalia had said, you know, the government is not in the business of legislating for adult relationships, love relationships. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, this is what's happened.
Yeah.
And so in the States, to say something as ordinary, mundane as a child deserves their mother and father could get you hauled up in front of authorities for bigotry.
Yeah.
And so this is the kind of illogical places it's taking us, that we cannot even proclaim really obvious like reality. And I didn't include this in the essay, but I think it started informing my thinking. I had read a book called Child 44, and it's based on, I think, Stalin era, and it's fictional, and they've made it into a movie. And part of that is showing basically there's a murder, and the child has been murdered, and there's a serial killer on the loose. And the whole structure, you can see it there in the movie, about what is reality and what is not, and whether it's based on reality is if the government says is reality, not what you see and what you observe. So they're trying now very hard to say this child wasn't murdered, because in utopia there is no murder. So they've redefined it as an accident or whatever else, and it goes through all the scenes of the suffering parents, and then they finally succumb to the state truth that the child wasn't murdered when it obviously was, and all the problems that it has. So that's Child 44, which really is a modern sort of look at how this plays out, and it's very dark and dreary, but it's very true. So you've got all these, you know, state truths rather than natural truths, obvious truths. And the other one, and I can't remember the title, is about what happened later on to the Ukraine. So the Ukraine was a food basin. Effectively, it's a very fertile land, and it was a food basin for the revolution. That's how it was then sort of seen. Yeah.
Okay.
And where they could not produce enough crop and fruit, literally they had to then sort of not feed their children, or just go back onto very sort of meagre rationings. But it came to the point where obviously they had hardly no food, and the government forcibly took every seed almost that they produced for the revolution, which was the industrialization and all the workers there, and literally annexed off that country, and every woman, child, man that was in there, grandparents, the whole thing, were slowly starved to death. This is the kind of brutality.
Yes.
And again, I take it back to their philosophical premise that if we are simply, a higher state of surviving, of this survival of the fittest narrative, it's logical you would think that way, that these people are weak, they're not able to withstand, they should die from attrition. Yep. Why not? Yep. So there were two movies that actually started to really impact and get a sense in me that this needed to be explored a bit more.
I like the way you finish your essay, and it's probably a good place to even conclude what we're talking about now. And in it, you write, I'm reminded of the final scene from the dystopian trilogy, The Hunger Games. The resistance emerges victorious, and its chief architect, Plutarch, writes a letter to the protagonist, Katniss Everdeen. The war is over. We'll enter that sweet period where everyone agrees not to repeat the recent horrors. 1917. Of course, we're fickle, stupid beings with poor memories and a gift for self-destruction. Although, who knows? Maybe this time we'll learn.
Yeah, who knows?
I hope and pray we will, you write. So thank you for that essay, and thank you for sharing some of your thoughts and insights with us. The link to Eleni's essay will be beneath this video. And if you want to Google it, it's From Russia with Love, an essay on one nation's experiment with marriage. And the title is longer, but I'm sure if you do that much, you'll find it. But the link's right beneath, and that's definitely recommended reading, although not incredibly brief. So thank you for joining us today. And if you'd like to be a partner with Church and State and sponsor the next episode, then head to churchandstate.com.au/partner, and you can make a small donation there, or even for just $3 a month, help us continue to bring insights and information to help us be better informed and less gullible in the face of the government's wills for our future. And until the next episode, we'll see you later.